Third time's the charm. Good evening, and welcome to the Health Data Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Jenny Owens, and today we're going to talk about one of my very favorite topics, a topic on which I could speak for hours, definitely have in the past, and probably will again in the future clinical trial ethics. So, I could talk about clinical trial ethics forever. I started my career as a research coordinator, spent a lot of time doing informed consent with patients and walking them through this is what your trial is going to involve. This is what your participation means, both now and in the future. And I find the rigorous ethics behind the conduct of clinical trials really interesting because the ethics and all of the rules and regulations around conducting clinical trials has, like most regulations, a really bloody history, right? We can talk about the Nazi human experimentation in the concentration camps. We can look on our own shores domestically and talk about the Tuskegee syphilis trials and other, horribly unethical medical experimentation. But out of all of that has come a brilliant framework for thinking about clinical trials. So I want to talk briefly about the current ethical framework for conducting clinical trials. And then I want to think about how we might, how that is changing, how I've seen that change over the course of my career, and how it might continue to change. So the basic ethical principles, and again, I could talk about each one of these for a long time, of conducting clinical research is that the outcome must be of social and or clinical value, right? We cannot do a clinical trial just to discover if people, like if we can get people to have blue eyes or brown eyes rather than, any other color. That's not of value. The trial must be designed to be scientifically valid. It must be sufficiently powered. You must be able to draw reasonable conclusions from the trial. You have to do fair subject selection. So you cannot, for example, solely recruit your clinical trial participants from people who are at a disadvantage socially. You cannot recruit exclusively from the poor. You cannot recruit exclusively from the prison population. Obviously, people who wish to participate in clinical research should not be barred from participating in clinical research for reasons of inequality, but you do have to be careful about how you are selecting your participants. You want to be able to offer your participants a favorable risk benefit ratio. So you want to feel at least reasonably certain and have enough preliminary data in your back pocket to say, you know what, actually, I think this has a shot. I think we might actually go somewhere with this. You do have to have an independent review. So it's not just you and your buddies and all the people who have been working on on your research for the past 20 years and they're all like deep in it. You have to have an independent review, and then most importantly, you have to have informed consent from the participants. And this is the part of the trial process that I spent the most time doing hands-on work, and it was really fascinating because I was working on a cancer biorepository. So not only was I telling people that I was going to be asking them for a sample of their tumor so that we could study it now. But we were also going to hang on to a sample of that tumor in perpetuity. The intention was to have it be stored for research now and in the future. And we might extract DNA, and the DNA would be used now and in the future. So I got to talk through the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. I got to explain this is what a biorepository is, and this is what it means to consent to a study now and also to future research that may not be enumerated to you at the time of consent. So it gave rise to some really interesting conversations. And I saw people on some of the worst days of their life, right? The days right before they have surgery for their cancer, the days after their cancer has recurred and they're back in the office. And people were almost uniformly kind and generous and helpful. And people, a lot of people want to participate in clinical research, including me. I have participated in clinical research basically my entire career. Um, what I am seeing and what is really interesting from my perspective as a research coordinator was patients were really engaged in the process. They were really curious. Will I hear about the results of the study? Will I get to know any of the information that you discover about my cancer? And for that particular study, it was a de-identified biorepository. So the answer was, of course, no. But I have seen over my career a shift in how we're thinking about who gets to have input in clinical trials, not only as far as what should we be studying, how should we go about recruiting, but also into some of the ethical principles governing clinical trials. I've seen a real shift from academics and medical personnel, and I've started to see the voice of the participant rise in those conversations. And that's really interesting to me because participants have a different lens on clinical research than the folks do who live it and breathe it all day, every day. They often bring a more useful perspective. That sounds bad. I say this as like a person who's been on both sides of this, right? They bring a really interesting, useful perspective. So a good example. Um, I was at a conference talking about the National Precision Medicine Initiative, and we had a bunch of participant representatives there. And I ended up spending about half an hour talking with this woman who was like, if we're going to do the Precision Medicine Initiative, like, yeah, absolutely, we should take samples, we should have blood, we should have DNA. She said, we need to talk with people about sleep. How are we going to capture data on people's sleep? That's such an important part of health. It's such an important part of how you feel every day. And I don't feel like that's being discussed really. We're talking about things that are easy to quantify, but we're not talking about the things that are difficult to quantify. It's a great perspective, right? I mean, think about what affects you in your day-to-day health. Did you get a good night's sleep last night or not? I did not. You can tell. Um, so I think it's really interesting, and I'm really encouraged to see more of an open dialogue between the participants or even the potential participants and the people designing the studies and the people sponsoring the studies and the bioethicists who are evaluating the studies. It's all great, right? We should all be having more conversations about everything all the time. Um, as part of this, I am starting to see, so this is, I think, due to a few factors, but I'm starting to see some discussion about endpoints possibly shifting. And I think this is due not only to the increased participation of participants in the conversations about clinical trials, but I also think it's a little bit because of the shift in what technologies are available for clinical trials. So if you're talking about, like, for example, a liquid biopsy or a very early blood-based cancer screening test, you're going to have different trial design and different endpoints, because if you're looking at, for example, an early detection cancer test, usually when you start looking at cancer stuff, your endpoint is death, right? Death. And for an early cancer detection test, that's not a great endpoint, right? Because you would expect to catch cancer early, right? We've got our colon cancer when it's at stage 1. This person's going to live another 40 years. I am really heavily reminded as well. So let me come back to this. So we might look at disease recurrence or detection of disease as an alternative endpoint to death. We might start looking at a biomarker we might start looking at biomarkers in collaboration with the disease type. So we might be looking for, a pancreatic cancer, not just pancreatic cancer that's carrying a particular enzyme. We might be weighing this as we're designing our study. Um, we might be looking at candidacy for curative interventions as opposed to, another endpoint. So if the person if we catch cancer early, right, when you're a candidate for surgery that will effectively cure your cancer, that's a great endpoint. That's something that we should be aiming for. And then the last endpoint that we often survey patients about, right, is their quality of life. And this is one that I often think of when I was reading clinical trials, protocols as a research coordinator. I found myself thinking a lot about a pancreatic cancer drug trial that I read about when I was in grad school, and we did a big journal club on this paper. This was a pancreatic cancer drug trial, and for people who aren't familiar with chemotherapy trials, you often recruit very late stage cancer patients, right? So your endpoint is death. And this particular pancreatic cancer drug was being hailed as like a major success. It was a huge, major success. It was a win, and it was a statistically significant win, and it extended the life of the late stage pancreatic cancer patients by 11 days. And during those 11 days, they had chronic life threatening diarrhea. Um, so it raised a lot of questions for us, and one of the things that we were discussing in class is, if you were the patient, would that 11 days be worth it, right? What is 11 days worth as far as side effects? And then as far as, what if your insurance isn't going to cover this drug? Is it worth, $10,000? Is it worth $100,000? If it's not you, if it's your family or your estate who has to pay for it? There's a lot of really interesting questions that arise from this. But one of the milestones, or the endpoints that we really do need to consider, is quality of life, and quality of life as measured by the participants. So yes, your activities of daily living, and yes, how are you able to work? Are you able to do the things that you want to do? Can you carry laundry up a flight of stairs? But is it worth it? Are you able to participate fully in the life that you want to have?